The traffic jam stretched for miles, and Lucas Hartman missed the most important flight of the year. Sitting in the terminal waiting for the next departure, surrounded by rushing travelers, he noticed a young woman in the corner of the lobby. She was beautiful, but dressed in worn clothes, sitting quietly like someone with nowhere to go. At first, he walked over to give her some cash and leave, but when she suddenly grabbed his hand and begged to borrow his car to go home, he froze. Why would a cautious man like him hand his keys to a complete stranger? Lucas Hartman had built his entire career on precision. Every meeting was scheduled down to the minute, every decision backed by data, every risk calculated 3 times over. He ran one of the fastest growing logistics companies in the region, and people respected him for it. They also kept their distance. That was fine with him. Control meant safety, and safety meant nothing fell apart. Today was supposed to be no different. He had a flight at 11:30 in the morning to close a contract that would double his company's freight capacity. The numbers were clean, the terms were locked in, and all he had to do was show up and sign. He left his house with plenty of time, traffic reports clear, everything under control. Then the highway turned into a parking lot. An overturned truck had spilled cargo across 3 lanes, and within minutes, thousands of cars sat motionless under the midday sun. Lucas checked his watch every 30 seconds. He called his assistant, rerouted through back streets, even considered abandoning the car and running. None of it mattered. By the time he reached the airport, his flight was gone. He stood at the counter while the gate agent apologized, in that rehearsed, detached way people do when they've said the same thing 100 times. The next available seat wasn't until 6 in the evening. Lucas didn't argue. He just nodded, took the new boarding pass, and walked into the terminal with his carry-on bag slung over one shoulder. The airport was loud and crowded, full of people who all seemed to know exactly where they were going. Lucas found a seat near the windows and sat down. He opened his laptop, tried to answer a few emails, but his mind kept circling back to the contract. His competitor would hear about the delay. They'd wonder if he was serious. He hated that. He closed the laptop and leaned back in the chair. His neck was tight, his jaw sore from clenching. He wasn't used to sitting still. There were always calls to make, problems to solve, decisions that couldn't wait. But here, in this sterile waiting area with its recycled air and fluorescent lights, there was nothing to do but wait. That was when he saw her. She was sitting near the exit that led to the parking garage, tucked into the corner where the main terminal hallway ended. Most people walked right past her without a second glance. She wasn't holding a sign or a cup, wasn't asking anyone for anything. She just sat there on the floor, with her back against the wall, knees pulled up to her chest, staring at nothing. Lucas noticed her because she didn't fit. She was young, maybe late 20s, with dark hair pulled into a loose ponytail. Her face was clean, her posture quiet but not defeated. She wore jeans that had seen better days, and a faded jacket that looked like it had been through a few winters. But it was her eyes that made him stop. They weren't empty. They were tired, yes, but still aware, still present. He told himself to look away. People ended up in all kinds of situations, and it wasn't his job to fix them. He had his own problems. But something about the way she sat there, so still in the middle of all that noise, made it hard to ignore her. Lucas stood up. He didn't plan it. His body just moved. He walked over slowly, keeping his expression neutral, his hands in his pockets. When he got close enough, he stopped a few feet away and looked down at her. She glanced up at him but didn't say anything. Her expression didn't change. No hope, no fear, just a kind of quiet acknowledgement that someone was standing there. Lucas reached into his wallet and pulled out 2 $20 bills. It was a reflex, something he'd done before when he passed someone on the street. A small gesture that let him feel like he'd done something without actually getting involved. He held the money out toward her. She looked at the bills in his hand, then back up at his face. She didn't take them. Lucas frowned slightly, unsure what to do next. He was about to say something when she spoke first. Her voice was soft but steady, not the voice of someone asking for pity. "I don't need money," she said. Lucas blinked. He wasn't sure he'd heard her right. "I need a car," she continued, and then she reached up and wrapped her fingers around his wrist. Not hard, not desperate, just enough to keep him from walking away. Her hand was cold. Lucas felt his pulse quicken. He looked down at her hand on his wrist, then back at her face. She was watching him closely now, and there was something in her expression that made his throat tighten. It wasn't manipulation. It wasn't a con. It was just raw, unfiltered need. "I need to go home," she said quietly. "Just let me borrow your car. I'll bring it back. I promise." Lucas pulled his hand back instinctively, and she let go without resistance. He took a step backward, his mind racing. This was insane. She was a stranger. He didn't know her name, didn't know where she came from or what she'd been through. Lending her his car was the kind of reckless decision he'd spent his entire adult life avoiding. "I can't do that," he said, though his voice came out less certain than he wanted. She didn't argue. She just looked at him for a long moment. Then lowered her gaze back to the floor. Her shoulders sagged slightly, and Lucas felt something twist in his chest. He hated that feeling. It was the same feeling he got when he saw his daughter upset and couldn't fix it with logic or money or a carefully worded explanation. He should have walked away. That was the smart thing to do. But instead, he stood there, staring at this woman he didn't know, and asked himself a question he hadn't asked in years. What if she's telling the truth? Lucas ran a hand through his hair and glanced around the terminal. No one was paying attention to them. The world kept moving, indifferent and fast. He looked back down at her, and she met his eyes again. There was no plea in her expression now, just a quiet resignation, as if she'd already accepted that he would say no. That look did something to him. It reminded him of the version of himself he used to be, back before the promotions and the board meetings and the carefully constructed life. Back when he still believed that people were worth the risk. Lucas reached into his pocket and felt the weight of his car keys. His mind screamed at him to stop, to think this through, to protect himself. But his hand kept moving. He pulled the keys out and held them in his palm, staring at them like they were something foreign. Then he looked at her one more time. She was watching him, her expression unreadable, waiting. Lucas took a breath and made a decision he couldn't explain. He held out the keys. The keys hung in the air between them, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Lucas could feel his heart beating harder than it should. This was a mistake. He knew it was a mistake. Every instinct he'd honed over years of business deals and calculated risks was screaming at him to pull his hand back, apologize, and walk away. But he didn't. The woman stared at the keys, then slowly reached out and took them from his palm. Her fingers brushed against his hand, and he noticed how cold they were. She held the keys carefully, like they might break, and looked up at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Thank you," she said quietly. Lucas nodded but didn't say anything. His throat felt tight. He took a step back, creating distance, and shoved his hands into his pockets. The logical part of his brain was already spinning out scenarios. What if she sold the car? What if she crashed it? What if she disappeared and he never saw it again? The car wasn't even expensive by his standards. A mid-range sedan he'd bought 3 years ago because it was practical and reliable. But that wasn't the point. The point was that he'd just handed over something valuable to a complete stranger based on nothing but a gut feeling. He cleared his throat and tried to sound firm. "I need it back by tonight. I have to catch a flight at 6. She nodded quickly. "I'll bring it back. I promise." Lucas wanted to believe her, but he'd heard promises before. People said what they needed to say to get what they wanted. That was just how the world worked. He studied her face, looking for signs of deception, but all he saw was exhaustion and something else he couldn't name. Something that looked like relief. "Where are you going?" he asked, even though he told himself it didn't matter. She hesitated, then looked down at the keys in her hand. "Just a place I used to stay. It's not far. Maybe an hour from here." Lucas frowned. "An hour? That's 2 hours round trip. You're cutting it close." "I know," she said softly, "but I'll make it. I have to." There was something in the way she said it that made Lucas stop pushing. He didn't know what she was going back for, and maybe he didn't want to know. Maybe it was easier this way, to just let her go and see what happened. He'd already made the decision. There was no point in second-guessing it now. "Okay," he said finally. "The car's in Section C, row 12. It's a gray Honda. License plate ends in 479. She repeated the information under her breath, memorizing it, then stood up slowly. She was shorter than he'd expected, and up close, he could see the faint lines around her eyes. The kind that came from too many sleepless nights. She tucked the keys into her jacket pocket and looked at him one more time. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. Lucas opened his mouth to answer, but nothing came out. He didn't have a good reason. He couldn't explain it in a way that made sense, not even to himself. So he just shrugged and said, "I don't know." She nodded slowly, as if that answer was enough, then turned and walked toward the exit. Lucas watched her go, weaving through the crowd of travelers with their suitcases and coffee cups and hurried conversations. She didn't look back. Within seconds, she was gone. Lucas stood there for a long time, staring at the spot where she'd disappeared. The terminal noise rushed back in around him, the announcements and footsteps, and distant hum of engines. He felt strangely light, like something had been lifted off his chest, but also untethered, like he'd just let go of something he couldn't get back. He walked back to his seat and sat down heavily. His laptop was still open, the screen dim. He didn't touch it. Instead, he leaned back and closed his eyes, trying to quiet the voice in his head that kept asking him what the hell he'd just done. The truth was, he didn't know, and that scared him more than he wanted to admit. Lucas had spent most of his adult life building walls. After his divorce, after the custody battle, after watching his ex-wife walk away with half of everything he'd worked for, he'd decided that control was the only thing that mattered. He couldn't control other people, but he could control his environment, his schedule, his decisions, his distance from anything that might hurt him. It had worked, mostly. His daughter was safe and happy, his company was thriving, and he'd managed to keep his life running smoothly without letting anyone get too close. But lately, there'd been this feeling, a kind of emptiness that crept in during the quiet moments, when the work was done, and the house was silent, and there was nothing left to distract him from the fact that he was alone. He'd told himself it didn't matter. Loneliness was the price of stability, and he was willing to pay it. But sitting here in the airport, waiting for a flight he didn't care about anymore, he wondered if maybe he'd been wrong. The woman hadn't asked for his story. She hadn't tried to manipulate him or guilt him into helping her. She'd just been honest, in a way that felt almost brutal. And maybe that was what had gotten to him, the simplicity of it, the lack of pretense. Lucas opened his eyes and checked his watch. It was just after 1 in the afternoon. He had almost 5 hours until his flight. 5 hours to sit here and wonder if he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life, or if he'd done something that actually mattered. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his messages. There were a dozen emails from his assistant, updates on the contract, reminders about calls he needed to make. He ignored all of them. Instead, he opened a blank note and typed out the license plate number of his car, just in case. Then he stared at the screen, trying to decide if he should call the police preemptively or just wait and see what happened. He didn't call. An hour passed. Then 2. Lucas tried to work, tried to read, tried to do anything that would stop him from checking his watch every 5 minutes. But his mind kept drifting back to the woman. He wondered where she was now, if she'd found the car, if she was already on her way back, or if she'd driven off and he'd never see her again. The thought didn't make him angry. It should have, but it didn't. Instead, it just made him feel tired. By 3:30, Lucas had resigned himself to the possibility that the car was gone. He'd already started mentally calculating the insurance claim, the hassle of getting a rental, the story he'd have to tell his assistant. It was fine. It was just a car. He'd bought it with money, and he could replace it the same way. But the keys had felt different in his hand, heavier than they should have been. Lucas stood up and walked to the windows overlooking the parking garage. He couldn't see Section C from here, but he looked anyway, scanning the rows of cars as if he might spot his own through sheer will. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the concrete. The airport was still busy, people coming and going, oblivious to the fact that somewhere out there, a stranger was driving his car to a place he'd never been. He turned away from the window and went to get coffee. The line was long, and he stood there with his hands in his pockets, listening to the barista call out orders in a tired voice. When it was finally his turn, he ordered a black coffee and paid with his card. The coffee was bitter and too hot, but he drank it anyway. By 4:15, Lucas had moved to a seat closer to his gate. He told himself it was just practical, that he needed to be ready when boarding started. But really, he just didn't want to be near that corner anymore, the spot where she'd been sitting. It felt too raw, too exposed. He pulled out his phone again and checked for messages. Nothing. No calls. No texts. No updates. Just silence. Lucas leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. He thought about his daughter, the way she used to look at him when she was younger, before the divorce, before everything got complicated. She used to think he could fix anything, and maybe he could back then. But somewhere along the way, he'd stopped trying to fix things and started just managing them instead. The woman's face flashed in his mind, the way she'd looked at him when she asked why he was helping her, the way she'd accepted his answer without pushing for more. Lucas didn't know what he'd expected. Maybe some grand revelation, some proof that he'd done the right thing. But life didn't work like that. Most of the time, you just made a choice and lived with it, and you never really knew if it mattered. He opened his eyes and checked his watch again. 4:45, just over an hour until his flight. If she was coming back, she needed to be here soon. Lucas stood up and walked back toward the parking garage exit, the same spot where she'd been sitting earlier. He didn't know why. Maybe he just needed to see it one more time, to confirm that she was really gone. He stood there for a few minutes, watching people walk past, their faces blank and preoccupied. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Lucas pulled it out and saw a text from an unknown number. "Your car is in C12. Keys under front mat. Thank you." Lucas stared at the screen. His hands trembled slightly as he read the message again. She'd done it. She'd brought the car back. He quickly typed a response, but before he could send it, another message came through. "Please don't look for me. Just know that what you did today saved me. You saw me as a person when no one else would. That means more than you'll ever know." Lucas stood frozen in the middle of the terminal, people streaming past him on both sides. He read the message 3 more times, his chest tight with an emotion he couldn't name. Then he turned and walked quickly toward the parking garage. The parking garage smelled like exhaust and concrete. Lucas's footsteps echoed as he walked down the ramp to Section C, his heart pounding harder with each step. When he reached row 12, he spotted his Honda right where he'd left it that morning. Gray, practical, unremarkable. He approached it slowly, half expecting to find damage or missing parts, some evidence that his trust had been misplaced. But the car looked fine, completely untouched. Lucas crouched down and felt under the front floor mat. His fingers closed around the familiar shape of his keys. He pulled them out and stood up, staring at them in his palm. She'd kept her word. Against all odds, against every cynical expectation he'd built up over the years, she'd actually brought the car back. He unlocked the door and slid into the driver's seat. The interior still smelled faintly of the air freshener he'd hung from the rearview mirror weeks ago. Everything was exactly as he'd left it. The registration in the glove box, the spare change in the cup holder, even the half-empty water bottle he'd forgotten in the side pocket. Nothing was missing. Lucas sat there for a moment, hands resting on the steering wheel, and let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. The fuel gauge showed it was lower than before, but not by much. She'd driven somewhere, done whatever she needed to do, and brought it back, just like she'd promised. Then he noticed something on the passenger seat. A small piece of paper, torn from a notebook, edges rough, folded once. Lucas reached over and picked it up. His hand shook slightly as he unfolded it. The handwriting was neat, careful. The letters formed with deliberate precision, as if she'd taken her time with each word. Thank you for seeing me as a person. You gave me more than your car today. You gave me hope that kindness still exists. I went back to get something I left behind a long time ago. Because of you, I have it back now. I can start over. Please don't worry about me. I'll be okay, and I'll never forget what you did. There was no signature, no name, just those words. Lucas stared at the note for a long time, his vision blurring slightly. His chest felt tight again, but this time it wasn't from anxiety or regret. It was something else entirely. Something he hadn't felt in years. Something that felt almost like healing. He folded the note carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket, then locked the car and headed back toward the terminal. His flight was boarding soon, and he needed to get through security. But his mind wasn't on the flight anymore. It wasn't even on the contract waiting for him in the other city. All he could think about was that note, those words. Thank you for seeing me as a person. How long had it been since someone thanked him for something that simple? How long had it been since he'd done anything that didn't come with conditions or expectations attached? Lucas walked through the terminal with his hands in his pockets, the note pressed against his chest. The airport felt different now, less sterile, less impersonal. He noticed things he hadn't before. An elderly couple holding hands while they waited at a gate. A young mother trying to calm a crying baby. A businessman asleep in his chair, tie loosened, briefcase at his feet. People. Just people. All of them going somewhere, all of them carrying their own stories. When Lucas reached his gate, boarding had already started. He joined the line and handed his boarding pass to the agent, then made his way down the jetway and onto the plane. His seat was in the middle of the cabin, a window seat he'd chosen out of habit. He stowed his bag in the overhead compartment and sat down, buckling his seatbelt as the flight attendants began their safety demonstration. The plane filled up slowly. A businessman took the aisle seat next to him, already typing on his laptop before they'd even pushed back from the gate. Lucas glanced at him briefly, then turned his attention to the window. The sun was starting to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. It was beautiful in a way he rarely stopped to notice. The engines rumbled to life, and the plane began to taxi toward the runway. Lucas leaned his head against the window and closed his eyes. He was exhausted. Not from lack of sleep, but from the weight of everything that had happened. The missed flight, the traffic, the decision to hand his keys to a stranger, the quiet miracle of getting them back. He thought about the woman again. He still didn't know her name, didn't know where she'd come from or where she was going now. But he knew something about her that mattered more than any of those details. She'd been desperate enough to ask a stranger for help, and brave enough to trust that he wouldn't hurt her. And he'd been brave enough to trust her back. The plane lifted off, and Lucas felt the familiar lurch in his stomach as the ground fell away beneath them. He opened his eyes and watched the city shrink below, the buildings and roads turning into a patchwork of lights and shadows. Somewhere down there, she was still out there. Still trying to find her way forward, whatever that meant. Lucas hoped she'd make it. Somehow, he believed she would. The flight was smooth and uneventful. Lucas didn't open his laptop, didn't check his emails, didn't think about the contract or the meeting or any of the things that had seemed so important that morning. Instead, he just sat there, staring out the window at the darkening sky, and let himself feel something he hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. When the plane landed 2 hours later, Lucas gathered his things and made his way through the unfamiliar airport to the rental car counter. He signed the paperwork, took the keys, and drove to his hotel in silence. The city was bright and busy, full of life, but he felt disconnected from it, like he was watching everything through glass. He checked into his room, dropped his bag on the bed, and stood at the window overlooking the downtown skyline. The meeting was tomorrow morning at 9. He had his notes prepared, his presentation polished, his arguments airtight. Everything was ready. But for the first time in years, Lucas didn't care if the deal went through or not. He pulled the note out of his jacket pocket and read it again. Each word felt heavier now, weighted with meaning he was only beginning to understand. Such a simple thing. Such an ordinary act of decency. And yet it had meant everything to her. And somehow, it had meant everything to him, too. Lucas sat down on the edge of the bed and stared at the note in his hands. He thought about all the people he passed every day without really seeing them. The barista who made his coffee, the security guard at his office, the woman who cleaned his house twice a week. He knew their faces, maybe even their names. But did he really see them? Did he treat them like people, or just like functions in his carefully organized life? He didn't like the answer. Lucas set the note on the nightstand and lay back on the bed, still fully dressed. The ceiling was white and blank, offering no answers. He thought about his daughter, about the kind of man he wanted her to grow up seeing. Not someone who had all the right answers, but someone who was willing to take risks when it mattered. Someone who chose kindness, even when it was inconvenient. He thought about the woman again, and he realized something that had been nagging at him all day. She hadn't just asked him for help. She'd given him something too. A reminder that the world wasn't as cold and transactional as he'd made it out to be. That trust still existed, even between strangers. That sometimes the best decisions were the ones that didn't make sense on paper. Lucas closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Tomorrow, he'd go to the meeting. He'd shake hands and sign papers and do all the things that were expected of him. But tonight, he was going to let himself sit with this feeling a little longer. This strange, uncomfortable, beautiful feeling of having done something that mattered. When he finally fell asleep, it was the deepest sleep he'd had in months. The next morning, Lucas woke up early and went for a run. He didn't usually run, didn't usually have time for it. But something about the cool morning air and the quiet streets made him want to move. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs ached, then walked back to the hotel and took a long shower. The meeting went exactly as planned. The clients were impressed, the terms were favorable, and by noon, Lucas had signed a contract that would take his company to the next level. His phone buzzed with congratulatory messages from his team, and his assistant had already scheduled a press release for the following week. But when Lucas left the building and stepped out into the sunlight, he didn't feel the rush he usually felt after closing a big deal. He just felt tired and a little bit empty. He got in his rental car and drove back to the airport, returned the keys, and boarded his flight home. The plane was crowded, and he ended up in a middle seat between a college student listening to music and an older woman reading a paperback novel. Lucas didn't mind. He spent the flight staring out the window at the clouds, his mind drifting. When he landed back home, it was late afternoon. Lucas picked up his car from the parking garage, the same car that had been borrowed by a stranger just yesterday. He ran his hand along the steering wheel before starting the engine, remembering. He drove through the city toward his house. The traffic was light, the streets familiar. Everything looked the same as it had 2 days before, but something inside him had shifted. He thought about the note in his jacket pocket, still folded and tucked away. He thought about the woman's words, the way she'd trusted him enough to ask for help. the way she'd honored that trust by bringing the car back. Lucas didn't know if he'd ever see her again. He didn't know if she'd found what she was looking for, or if she was still out there somewhere, struggling to get by. But he knew one thing for certain. He was different now. Not in some dramatic, life-changing way. He wasn't going to quit his job, or sell all his possessions, or dedicate his life to helping strangers. But he was going to pay more attention. He was going to see people, really see them, the way she'd asked to be seen. Because that was the thing about kindness. It didn't have to be grand or heroic. It just had to be real. Lucas pulled into his driveway and turned off the engine. The house was dark and quiet, waiting for him. He sat there for a moment, hands still on the steering wheel, and allowed himself to smile. Then he got out of the car, locked the door, and walked inside. The world kept turning. Life went on. But somewhere in the middle of all that noise and chaos and endless rushing, Lucas Hartman had chosen to trust a stranger. And in doing so, he'd reminded himself that he was still human, still capable of hope, still willing to believe that people were worth the risk. And that, more than any contract or any deal or any carefully calculated decision, was the thing that would stay with him long after the memory of that day had faded. Sometimes, healing doesn't come from controlling everything around you. It comes from the moment you dare to place your trust in someone you don't know, and in doing so, rediscover the part of yourself that still believes in something good.